All right, today we are going to start with our lesson on the road to Lexington and Concord. Let me get this off of here. And we have a lot going on in this section. Right here is a picture of Captain John Parker, who was a captain of the Massachusetts militia. And I want to tell you a little bit about him, but at dawn on April 19th in 1775, there were about 70 militiamen that gathered on the grassy common near the center of Lexington, Massachusetts, which was a small town near Boston. This guy right here, Captain John Parker, he was a veteran of the French and Indian War, and he was the commander. And the militia was a force of armed civilians that pledged to defend their community. About 1/3 of the Lexington militia were Minutemen. They were trained to be ready to act at a minute's warning. Everyone had heard the news the British were coming, so each militiaman was equipped with a musket, a bayonet, and ammunition, and Parker had spent considerable time, months, drilling his troops, but they had never faced anything like the British soldiers. Soon they would meet the British head-on in Lexington Green in the first battle of the Revolutionary War. According to tradition, Parker told his men, "Stand your ground and don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have war, let it begin here." So in this section today, we're going to take a look at how colonial protests eventually turned into violent revolution. So with our learning targets today, by the end of this section, you should be able to describe the intolerable acts. You should be able to explain how the colonies wavered between war and peace. You should be able to profile the Midnight Ride, and you should be able to describe the battles of Lexington and Concord. So let's begin. First of all, the two key terms from the story that I just told you. A militia is a force of armed civilians pledged to defend their community. These are the common people, your Joe Schmoes, your average citizen in town. Essentially, they were given a gun and they were trained a little bit, and they went from their normal jobs to being volunteer army, essentially. And then within the militia, we had our Minutemen, and they were trained to act at a minute's notice. And this is typically what your average militiaman would look like. So a uniform and a musket, but nothing very high tech here at all. Now, the Boston Tea Party from our last section had aroused fury in Britain. They were mad. One official from Britain said that the people of Boston ought to be knocked about their ears. King George III declared, "We must master them or totally leave them to themselves and treat them as aliens." Britain definitely chose to master the colonies. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws that were specifically to punish the Massachusetts colony and to serve as a warning to other colonies. The British called these laws the Coercive Acts, but they were so harsh that the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. Now, one of the acts would close the port of Boston until colonists paid for all the tea that they destroyed. Others banned the committees of correspondence. They allowed Britain to house troops wherever necessary, and they let British officials accused of crimes in the colonies stand trial in Britain. So to enforce the acts, Parliament appointed General Thomas Gage the governor of Massachusetts. In 1773, Sam Adams wrote, "I wish we could arouse the continent." Well, the Intolerable Acts did just that. Other colonies immediately offered Massachusetts their support, and they sent food and money to Boston, and the committees of correspondence also called for a meeting of colonial delegates to discuss what to do next. And here in this picture, this is what becomes the First Continental Congress, which we'll talk about next. Now, in September of 1774, delegates from all over the colonies except Georgia met in Philadelphia. At this meeting, it came to be known as the First Continental Congress. Delegates voted to ban all trade with Britain until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. This is a pretty heated meeting. There were a lot of passionate debates going on in the First Continental Congress. They also called on each colony to begin training troops, and Georgia, even though they were not there, did agree to be part of the actions of the Congress. So the First Continental Congress was a big step in American history. Although most delegates were not ready to call for independence, they were determined to uphold their colonial rights. This meeting planted the seeds of a future independent government, and actually John Adams, the lawyer who defended the Redcoats, he called it a nursery of American statesmen. The delegates did agree to meet in 7 months if necessary, and by that time, however, fighting with Britain had already begun. Now, in the first session of the Continental Congress, the delegates rejected by a vote of 6-5 Pennsylvania delegate Joseph Galloway's plan to create a union of the colonies. Galloway's plan of union included a grand council with delegates from all the colonies that would deal with issues affecting more than one colony. Legislation would be subject to Parliament's approval. The council would also have the right to reject Parliament's legislation. So they did actually talk about starting their own country, so to speak. Moving on, the colonists hoped that the trade boycott would force a repeal of the Intolerable Acts because, as in the past, boycotts had worked. It repealed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts. But this time, Parliament stood very firm. Not only did they stand firm, but they even increased restrictions on colonial trade, and they sent more troops over to the colonies. By the end of 1774, some colonists were preparing to fight. In Massachusetts, John Hancock headed the Committee of Safety, which had the power to call out the militia. And meanwhile, the colonial troops did continue to train. Most colonial leaders believed that any fight with Britain would be pretty short. They figured that if they were to show force, Britain would maybe change their policies. Very few expected a war, but one that did was Patrick Henry, this man here on the left with his hand raised. And he said, "Gentlemen may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren, our brothers, are already in the field. Why should we idle here? I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." Henry delivered what became his most famous speech by far in the Virginia House of Burgesses in March of 1775, and that's the picture you're seeing here. Now, meanwhile, spies were busy on both sides. Sam Adams had built a spy network to keep watch over British activities, and the British had their spies too. They were Americans who were loyal to Britain. From them, General Gage learned that the Massachusetts militia was storing arms and ammunition in Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. He also heard that Sam Adams and John Hancock were in Lexington. So on the night of April 18, 1775, Gage ordered his troops to arrest Adams and Hancock in Lexington and also destroy the supplies in Concord. The only problem was the Sons of Liberty were already prepared for this moment. I'm going to move on to the next slide, but pause if you need to. Paul Revere was a silversmith in Boston, and another messenger with him, William Dawes, were given the task of spreading the news about British troop movements. Revere arranged a system of signals to alert colonists in Charlestown on the shore opposite of Boston. If one lantern burned in the Old North Church steeple, the British troops were coming by land. If two, they were coming by water. So that's the famous line, one if by land, two if by sea. So Revere would go across the water from Boston to Charlestown and ride to Lexington and Concord from there, and Dawes would take the land route. And here is the actual Old North Church steeple, which still stands today. They put their lanterns right up here in the top, and for most people, they wouldn't even think twice to see lanterns up there, but the people that were in the know, the spies, they definitely knew what was going on, and that was their light to look for. Now, when the British moved, so did Revere and Dawes. They galloped all over the countryside on what came to be known as their midnight ride, spreading news. In Lexington, they were joined by a guy named Dr. Samuel Prescott, and when Revere and Dawes were stopped by a British patrol, Prescott broke away and he carried the message to Concord. Now, you can see the map here. They did start down in Boston, and eventually you can see Dawes is in red going up this way, and Revere is in blue. And then they get out to Lexington, and then Prescott keeps going here in the green all the way out past Concord. Now, at dawn on April 19th, about 700 British troops reached Lexington, and they found Captain John Parker and about 70 militiamen waiting. The British commander ordered the Americans to drop their muskets, but they refused, and no one exactly knows who fired first, but within a few minutes there were 8 militiamen that lay dead on the ground. The British then marched on to Concord, where they destroyed military supplies, but a battle broke out at a bridge north of town, which forced the British to retreat. And here you can see the battle that took place in Lexington. Now, nearly 4,000 Minutemen and militiamen arrived in the area, and they lined the road from Concord all the way to Lexington, and they peppered the retreating redcoats with musket fire the whole way back. One soldier actually said it seemed as if men came down from clouds. The only thing that saved the British was that 1,000 more troops from Britain showed up and helped fight back, and that saved the British from destruction as they scrambled back into Boston. So they were very, very close to being obliterated by this, ragtag militia before the revolution actually even began. Now, Lexington and Concord were the first battles of the Revolutionary War, and as Ralph Waldo Emerson later wrote, colonial troops had fired the shot heard around the world. Americans would now have to choose sides and back up their political opinions by force of arms. Those who supported the British were called loyalists, and those who sided with the rebels were patriots. So the conflict between the two sides divided communities, families, and even friends, and the war was definitely on. And moving on in section 4, we will take a look at how we declared independence and how we started to get ready to fight the Revolutionary War.